Hello, everybody. I'll just let us get in and get settled, and then we'll kick off proper. Before we start, of course, I want to acknowledge, celebrate, pay respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands that I'm coming to you from here in Canberra, and of course to all of the First Nations peoples around Australia and around the world. I say paying respects to those peoples and lands, and just really acknowledging that, well, certainly I'm coming from unceded lands, as I say, in Ngunnawal Ngambri people's lands, and paying respects to elders past and present. So I'm Sharon Friel. I head up the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse. I'm based in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the ANU. And as you know, on a monthly basis, we run this very modestly titled Saving the World webinar series, where we really dig deep into some of the issues in what we call the consumptogenic system, this system of institutions, policies, commercial activities, norms, issues of power, of course, front and center of all of that, that is really just baking in the production and consumption of fossil fuel goods and services, and everything that's connected to that. And for us, we are very concerned about that because, of course, it's really bad for the environment, it's really bad for inequality, and it's really bad for human health. And so the big question is, what's driving all of that? And very importantly, how do we get out of all of that? And so what we do in the webinar series is discuss all of that. And as always, I'm joined with a colleague from the hothouse today. I'm delighted to be joined by Roxana Tompea, who's one of the PhD scholars really looking at some of the issues that we're going to hear from Jennifer about, these questions of corporate control, power, greenwashing, but Roxana will tell you more about that later. So we are so excited to be joined by Jennifer, Professor Jennifer Clapp. Jennifer, as many of you know, Jennifer is a Canadian Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability, and Professor in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability in Waterloo, at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Jennifer really is one of the leaders, probably the leader, I think, in these questions of political economy, corporate control, questions around the food system, the agri-food system. She's a member of the International Panel, excuse me, of experts on sustainable food systems, and really helping to ensure that those deliberations pay attention to, let's say, this consumptogenic system. And I'm just so delighted that Jennifer is also a member of the Hothouse Advisory Board. So really, no further ado, no more nonsense from me. I just want to hand over to Jennifer. We'll hear from Jennifer for about 30 minutes or so. Then Roxana will make just a few reflections and pose a few questions to Jennifer. And then, of course, we'll go open up for questions, discussion with the audience. So over to you, Jennifer. Huge thanks.
Thank you, Sharon, very much for that invitation. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about my new book. And I was sitting in a comfy chair the other night and got an email from the hothouse saying, it said, Jennifer Clapp saves the world. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's a lot of pressure. I think what I will do is help understand how the world is complicated and maybe some of the steps we can take to save the world. But first, I'd like to say that I'm speaking from Waterloo, Ontario. So it's nighttime on Wednesday for me, although it's Thursday morning for you. And I'm speaking on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee First Nations peoples. And I'm deeply grateful to be able to live and work on this land where I have been working for the past while on my new book, The Titans of Industrial Agriculture. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. And I would like to talk a bit about the book, which is about the 4 agricultural input industries, referencing specifically farm machinery, fertilizer, seeds, and pesticides. And the book tries to tease out how we went from these 4 inputs that weren't even market commodities, say 200 years ago, to being now controlled by just a handful of very powerful firms. And the book explores the dynamics that led to this concentration, but also the consequences of that transition to highly concentrated markets in the sector. And I'm going to speak probably for 25, 30 minutes and look forward to the discussion afterward. So given that I only have around 30 minutes, I'm gonna, it's nowhere near enough time to give a blow-by-blow in detail about a 400+ page book spanning 13 chapters. So I'm just gonna map out some very broad themes, and hopefully if there are questions, we can pick them up in the Q&A. But what I'm gonna do in terms of my agenda, I'm gonna talk about why I wrote this book. I'm going to give a bit of a background on the main arguments and also talk about some of the lessons for policy and the big takeaways. And I'll say the most about the arguments because the book itself has several interconnected arguments. But I just want to briefly say something about this image that's on the screen because it was something I stumbled across while doing my research and opened an article about some of the firms that were consolidating. And the first lines of the article were about a farm machinery factory in Waterloo, Ontario, and it was called the Sunshine Waterloo. And I realized while I was reading about this that this is just down the street from where I live, and I walk on a 1-block street every day to get to campus, and it's called Sunshine Avenue. And I never knew why it was called Sunshine, but that's where the factory once stood. It is now an empty field. I'm pretty sure it's a brown field. Not much going on there, but it put a lot of things together for me in terms of making the connection to my own town and my own neighborhood to these bigger themes that I'm talking about in the book. So first, why did I write this book? Well, I really wrote this book because I've had a long interest in corporate power in general. As Sharon mentioned, I do a fair bit of work on this theme. And that interest goes back at least to the very beginning of my career, spanning some 30 years, when I've been teaching and talking about corporate strategies, especially in agricultural biotechnology, which is a topic I started looking into back in the 1990s. And in the time since that early part of my career until today, we've seen corporate power in the wider economy only grow. We've seen the rise of the big tech firms. We've seen the rise of very concentrated and powerful insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, asset management firms, and growing concerns in society more broadly about monopoly power and its association with the widening of inequality in the world and how concentration and inequality spills over into politics and wider aspects of life, including societal, ecological, and health dimensions. I mean, all of these things that the Hothouse really focuses on is this backdrop to why I wanted to work on this book. But I felt that while a lot of the attention was being paid to the big tech firms, there was a lot less attention being paid to other sectors such as agriculture. Yet agriculture is an interesting sector because corporate dominance not only has it been surging in recent years, and it's been quite tangled up in financial dynamics, which is something that I've also been researching. But this dominance has a really long history, and we can really learn from it to understand better about dynamics of corporate power and inequality and ecological and social effects more generally. So I was spurred to sort of begin the work on this project after learning and experiencing, the news and reading about these recent mergers. I guess I say recent now, but it's 10 years ago that these kind of most recent mergers began in the sector, and that was around 2015. And it started in late 2015 when Dow and DuPont announced that they would merge and form a new massive chemical company, and they spun out 3 firms from this. They merged and then they spun out 3 separate firms, one of which is called Corteva, which focuses specifically on agricultural chemicals and seeds. So that happened. And then just a few months later, ChemChina announced that it was going to buy Syngenta, which, a European-based agrochemical and seed company as well. And then subsequently, Sinochem, one of the biggest chemical companies in the world, swallowed this new firm of ChemChina and Syngenta combined. Even though it's kind of confusing, they still market themselves globally as Syngenta Group. And then not too long after, we saw Bayer announce its purchase of Monsanto, which is now subsumed under the name of Bayer. And this sort of really reconfigured the entire sector. And in the midst of this, as these companies were merging, when they got regulatory approval from governments around the world, they were actually required to spin off some elements to reduce any excess concentration. And that the other company, the big company BASF, stood ready to buy all of these parts. And then they also got bigger, and they previously were only focused on agrochemicals, and now they have seed interests as well. So we ended up with, what were previously big six companies plus the Chinese pesticide company, now becoming four big firms dominating in the agricultural input sector. And then right in the middle of all this stuff happening, there was another big merger, which was between two massive fertilizer companies, both based in Canada, one called Agrium and the other one Potash Corporation. And they combined to form a new firm called Nutrien back in 2016. So there was just this flurry of activity. And then in the backdrop to what was going on at this time, the big agricultural machinery companies like Deere and CNH and AGCO, et cetera, were buying up digital startup companies because they wanted to get into digital farming. So they were making a whole host of smaller mergers and acquisitions at the same time this was going on. So basically, I wanted to understand what was going on in the sector. But just to give the, a sense or a snapshot of what we see right now is today the top four firms in each of these areas. One is seeds and pesticides, because those once were separate industries, they're now one, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Fertilizers, and then farm machinery. We have four dominant firms globally in each of those parts of the agricultural inputs market, and they're very concentrated in terms of the share of the market they control. So in the seed sector, for example, the top four firms control around 60% of the global seed market. But if you dig down and look at the domestic level in many parts of the world, that concentration is actually even higher. So for example, in North America, the top four seed companies control over 80% of soy, maize, and canola seeds. And there's something like 15 countries around the world for which maize seed control of the top four firms exceeds 80%. So it's quite significant concentration. And those same companies control around 70% of global pesticide sales. Again, at the domestic level, it can be even more concentrated. The top four farm machinery firms control around 50% of the global farm machinery market, but again, more pronounced at the domestic level. So for example, in North America, John Deere alone controls 60% of the heavy-duty tractor sales. It's quite a dominant player. And then the top four fertilizer companies, as you can see here, Yara, CF Industries, Nutrien, and Mosaic, they're also very, very concentrated. We don't have good data on their percentage of the global market they control, but that market is unusual and it's quite fractured because there's different nutrients that make up fertilizer. But in the, say, for example, in the North American context, the top four companies control around 100% of the potash, and just two companies control around 75% of nitrogen fertilizer production. So concentration going on in this sector. So when I was sort of watching these trends, seeing this unfold right before our eyes, and I wanted to understand, how did we get here when these inputs were not even market commodities 200 years ago? And should we be worried? And so I started to dig into research on this topic and wanted to figure out what was going on. And in terms of my approach, I was really inspired by the work of Louis Brandeis. He was a US Supreme Court justice and a lawyer who worked on issues of corporate power and concentration. And there's a quote that I was reading one of his early pamphlets called Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It, which I think is a fabulous title for, and it could have been written yesterday. I swear, it's so prescient. But he says in this document, size, we are told, is not a crime, but size may at least become noxious by reason of the means through which it was attained or the uses to which it is put. So in other words, what he was saying is he was quite worried about firms getting very large, especially if they were getting large because of mergers and acquisitions. So in other words, because they were able to, in his view, abuse market power to get money to buy up their rivals, which then squashed competition. And he feared that this bigness of firms would risk undermining democracy. And so in his work, he actually called on scholars to understand how this corporate concentration emerged so that policies could better address it more effectively. And he specifically called on scholars to look at what happened in the 19th century that led to the rise of the bigness, because he was writing obviously over 100 years ago. And I realized nobody had really done this in the agricultural sector. And I really wanted to sort of take up his call for research in this area and understand what was going on and see what the broader lessons are. So what did I find? Well, first, I want to say that this book took me about 5, maybe 6 years to work on. I was very intensely working on it during the pandemic years. I was fortunate I had a 2-year teaching release to work on the book, and I had a sabbatical in there. So I was quite lucky that I could put some quality time to focus on it. And what I found, and I ended up writing a book that was much longer than I anticipated, but I developed a 3-part argument that I can't obviously give the whole details of everything, but I'll just give the really broad brushstrokes. And this 3-part argument, the first part tries to answer the question, how did these firms get so big in the first place? And, I put on the screen here some old advertising materials. Partly, I think they're really interesting images to look at, but some of these are companies you've likely heard of, like John Deere on there, and Dow. You've probably heard of these firms, but maybe some of the other ones like Funk Brothers Seeds or Pioneer or even the Royster Fertilizer Company, you might not have heard of. But these were some of the biggest firms early on in these industries. But in reality, what we've seen in the period since is these firms have basically merged and acquired other firms and eventually become, given new names and so forth. But all these firms on the screen here eventually became part of some of the biggest players in the market today. So what I was looking at is like, well, how did this happen? And the firms themselves that are at the top of the market today would want you to believe that, well, they got big because they simply were more innovative. They were more efficient. They were simply better at what they do than others. And they grew large by hard work. But the reality is most of it was mergers and acquisitions, and there were a host of factors at play. So I'm going to talk about 3 big areas in which I see answering this first question about how they got so big. And one of those was market dynamics. And these, I just explained the picture here. This McCormick Reaper Works in 1902. Just at the time, there was a massive merger of 7 big firms that created a new company called International Harvester. But you can see it took up blocks and blocks and blocks and acres of land, this huge industrial factory. And in terms of these market dynamics, the size matters because it gave these firms some economies of scale. They could produce their goods at a per unit cost that was lower if they were producing in large quantities. But these are not the only market factors that mattered for how these firms got big and acquired one another. Another is that they had privileged access to finance. So many of the merger and acquisition deals that were taking place across the input sector had a lot to do with financing from big banks like JP Morgan and other kinds of financiers that were bankrolling these kind of mergers. And also there were investor pressures to increase returns on these companies, especially once they became publicly listed. And so these factors continue, I do argue today, these kinds of factors still matter in explaining mergers and acquisitions. Just to give a quick example, I mean, one of the the Dow and DuPont merger that happened in 2015 was the direct follow-on from major pressure from two big activist investors, Nelson Peltz, you might have heard of him, he's like a corporate raider, and Daniel Loeb. These guys have um, big hedge funds, and they bought up significant shares in both of these firms. And when commodity prices started to fall after 2013, they really pushed for restructuring of the firms, and the result was the merger. So these kinds of pressures, they're kind of like a continuing factor that matters for this kind of consolidation. A second big set of factors I talk about are the technological drivers. This is a photo of the BASF plant in Oppau in Germany, where they first synthesized ammonia for nitrogen fertilizer manufacture in 1909 with a Haber-Bosch process. And I believe this facility like blew up not too much after this picture was taken. But anyway, because it's quite, nitrogen synthesis is important for bomb making. So that's super important. And that was an important part of the story too, is this sort of connection, which I'll talk about in a minute, to government national interests. But what we saw here is that the firms weren't necessarily just more clever, but they basically were able to capitalize on transformative innovations, both inside and outside of the sector. So when the, fossil fuel powered tractor came along, that was like coming from the automobile industry, but it was taken up in the farm machinery industry. But many of these innovations weren't just that they were better, they were people at the right place at the right time. Cyrus McCormick may have invented the reaper, but he wasn't the first one, but he certainly capitalized on it because he was in Chicago. He was able to move his factory to Chicago and benefit from the advance of the railways and the expansion westward in North America. Many of these firms also benefited from patents that enabled them to basically have a 20-year monopoly on their innovations. So that was extremely important. And also, over time, we started to see growing technological lock-in of these industrial agriculture technologies, fertilizer, seeds, pesticides, and machinery, that gave ready markets to these firms. So they were able to benefit from these kind of technology drivers that then fueled this mergers and acquisitions, especially as lock-ins started to take hold, and there was a desire to link up firms across sectors. And a more modern day example of this was the advent of agricultural biotechnology in the 1980s through the early 2000s. There was a huge host of mergers in the sector, and it was in large part because agricultural biotechnology enabled firms to modify seeds to make them resistant to the application of specific herbicides. And so it brought the herbicide, chemical firms together with the seed firms, and we saw a massive mashup of those industries. And then a third big factor I talk about are the policy context and policy factors, because many of the firms that grew big, they had direct government support, they benefited from subsidies, they benefited from direct handouts, they benefited from government research, and they also benefited from policies because those industries were important for national security. So, we saw that kind of government support to firms. And the example here on the screen is this, almost all the research that went into the hybridization of corn that was extremely important for the seed industry was done by the US government under public dollar, and then those firms were able to profit from it. Governments also put in place those policies that protected intellectual property, and they also had, competition policies, but they're often unevenly applied. And I want to just give a more recent example of that, which I really talk about in the book with respect to the most recent mergers, which is that, there was this, rise of neoliberalism after the late 1970s, and it led to Robert Bork. He was, an important figure in Reagan's government in the neoliberal era, and he basically said antitrust policy needs to be totally rewritten, and it was making it much more lax in terms of the application of the rules, because he thought bigness brought lower prices, and that was all he was focused on, and he wasn't thinking about many of the other consequences. And so it led to a 30-year period where the US government and many other governments around the world followed, were quite relaxed in allowing mergers and acquisitions to happen without being, applying the law as it was written to prevent consolidation. So over the years, what we saw were waves of mergers and acquisitions that dramatically reshaped the sector. And I've mentioned this already, seeds and chemicals came together. There was massive consolidation of fertilizer and farm machinery over over the space of a century. And in the book, I go through these like nerdy diagrams that I spent hours and hours making. I'm just going to share one of them, but this sort of gives an idea from the pesticides industry, the kinds of mergers and acquisitions that were happening from the mid 1800s to today, and how we ended up with just 4 companies really dominating. You can see the lighter green bubbles are when they bought seed companies, but basically there was a lot of consolidation that took place early in the 20th century, and then it just kind of, we saw these waves of concentration and mergers happening till today. And then also here's just a graphic showing how all of the companies across all of the input sectors are now investing quite extensively in startup companies in both digital agriculture and also genome editing. And it's fascinating to me that all the firms in the sector, especially regarding digital agriculture, they're all investing in it. And so it's leading to a situation where we're seeing the industries having increasingly shared interests in terms of their business interests, and therefore I would say it's not fantastical to think that we might see more cross industry mergers happening in the future. Maybe a one-stop shopping for agricultural inputs is not an outlandish idea. It's possible. And so a second part of my argument is that is kind of responding to this question of, well, how do these firms benefit? Like once they get big, what's happening? And I argue in the book that the fact of these industries getting so big through these mergers and acquisitions, it lends them certain kinds of power that lets them stay big. So it kind of creates a self-perpetuating cycle. So I talk about the fact that these firms have the power to shape markets. They gain the power to shape technology and technological trajectories, and they gain the power to shape policy and governance. And through each of these means, it kind of got confused, like a little complicated, but it's also really simple. Like these are the very factors, market, technology, and policy, that let them get big. And once they get big, they can actually shape those factors to their own benefit. So I'll just talk a little bit about what that means in practice. So in terms of shaping markets, like there are all kinds of ways in which big firms can shape markets to their advantage. And typically economists say, well, when the top 4 firms control over 40% of the market, then it's sort of moderately concentrated. And when they control over 60% of the market, it's concentrated, much more concentrated. And once, as that ratio of the top 4 firms of the market that they control gets higher, they tend to have what economists call market power, which is this ability to shape the factors of supply and demand to the extent that they can reap excess profits. So I just wanted to give a few examples of what this looks like today and what we're seeing in terms of the ability of these top firms to shape markets. And I apologize, my cat is crying at the door. I hope you can't hear her. But you might see her. Anyway, so some examples. One is that John Deere, for example, was recently sued by the US government just at the beginning of this year because they were dominating the market for farm repairs. So as farm machinery is becoming more digitalized, more complicated, governed by software embedded in these machines, Deere did not want farmers fixing their own tractors, and they didn't want third-party repair shops fixing tractors either. What they wanted was to control that market, and so they required purchasers of those tractors to sign what they call end-user license agreements that says that if they're going to repair the tractor, it has to be done either by a licensed Deere dealership or by a licensed Deere authorized repair shop. And that is in a sense controlling the market in a way that they were able to charge higher prices. And this was it has still extremely frustrating for farmers because they feel like, hey, I bought this machine, I should be able to do whatever I want with it. And Deere went so far as to say, well, you may have, forked out $100,000 for that machine, but you don't really own it. You just own the right to use it. And so it's sort of creating this situation where they've got extreme control over that part of the market. So that's one example. Another example that's quite recent is concern about the fertilizer industry. So prices really spiked when, the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. Prices went crazy. Obviously, we know global supply chains were also disrupted for fertilizers. And as prices went up, farmers were very concerned that these companies were profiteering. And I put a graphic here on the slide. You can see the profits of the top 4 companies just ballooned into 2022, went really high. And it's not just their overall profits that rose, because that might happen if fertilizer input prices went up, but their marginal rate of profit also soared. And so they were making huge amounts of money. They were even bragging in their own reports to their own shareholders that they were able to charge prices that were higher than their increased costs of production, and that this was a good thing because it meant more profits. So they basically even admitted that they were doing this. And of course, farmers were quite concerned, and this prompted the US government to look into it. Another example is pesticide industry paying loyalty rebates to retailers. So again, they're shaping the market in a way that they're trying to drive demand towards their own products. So in this case, and again, these companies are being sued in the North American context, but they were giving rebates to retailers of input providers, like retail companies, that paid them to keep generic products off the shelf because they didn't want farmers to buy generics that were cheaper. They wanted them to buy the brand name products. And so they basically paid off the retailers to do this. Again, they were shaping the market. And the reason they could do this and get away with it is because there's just a few companies that control these markets. And it's very easy for them, whether they're, implicitly cooperating with one another or explicitly have an agreement, they can kind of get away with it, because even if they have no written agreement, if one firm does it, the others tend to follow. And so this is a really important problem, is market power. But a big part of the reason I wanted to write the book is to say it's not just market power that matters. Technology power matters, and these companies have this ability to shape technology, and there's lots of ways in which these dominant firms can shape technological trajectories in the sector. I mentioned the case of engineering seeds to be resistant to specific herbicides in the move to ag biotech, and that was certainly one big way in which these giant firms were shaping technological trajectories. And in fact, it's very difficult right now for farmers to acquire soy seeds and maize seeds that are not genetically modified. It's almost like the conventional stuff is just kind of dropped out of the marketplace. But then in more recent times, these firms have been really pushing both digital farming and genome editing as key technological directions within the sector. And it's leading to this kind of herbicide-centric approach to agriculture, especially because those digital technologies are often about precision spraying of herbicides, and the genome editing is using genome editing techniques to sort of do what they did with the ag biotech, which is to make seeds more susceptible to being sprayed by herbicides. But they're also doing stuff like spraying or modifying weeds to resensitize them to herbicides when they've actually become resistant to them. Like, there's all kinds of strange stuff that they're doing, but it's sort of, they're really driving these technological directions in the sector. And then also, the third kind of power that they get is to shape policy and governance. And then again, there's a multitude of kinds of strategies firms use to try and shape policy and governance. And, here's a picture of the big CEOs from the big companies in the 2016 hearing about the mergers that were happening back then. But they engage specifically in lobbying and revolving door kinds of appointments. And then in the book, I talk a lot about these kinds of examples. They engage in partnerships. Like, there was a big partnership going on in the last few years between FAO and CropLife, which is the big pesticide and seed company lobby group. That partnership has since ended after civil society raised a lot of alarms about it. But they also do things maybe that's less visible, like sponsoring scientific studies. Like, Monsanto sponsored a whole host of studies about the safety of glyphosate. And some of those studies were even used in regulatory decision-making. And then it was revealed in court papers that they had basically ghostwritten papers that were signed by academics and a bit of a mess. And they also engage in discursive influence, where they're simply doing advertising and public outreach to try and shape the way that people think about their products, and also to shape the way regulators think about their products. So again, there are just lots of examples of how this kind of shaping of policy and governance happens. So these three kinds of power, the kind of market, technology, and political power, really gel in a way that I do argue creates some big problems. And I summarize it in the book in this diagram, and maybe it's a bit of a simplistic diagram, but for me, I actually developed this quite early on in writing the book, because it was at the roadmap to understanding how these factors unfold, how the dynamics happen. So when you've got this concentration and it leads to bigness in these firms, they gain these kinds of power, and it has specific consequences. It can lead to higher prices. It can create barriers to smaller firms to enter the market. It drives more profit-oriented innovations over other innovations, and it leads to undue influence that can undermine democracy. And so there are lots of consequences that can result from this kind of concentration of power, ranging from, higher prices, less autonomy for farmers, these fewer opportunities, tech lock-ins, externalization of costs, undermining democracy, and reinforcing inequalities. And it was, for me, this visual was a way to understand how all these diverse effects kind of do link back in several ways to this concentration of power in the system. And so I am coming towards the end, Sharon, so I hope I'm not talking for too long, but, some examples of the costs, I divide these into more direct and indirect costs, but as I said already, these higher costs can threaten farmers' livelihoods and make food more expensive. Farmers can lose autonomy and become de-skilled regarding, the things they use on the farm. Farmers used to have all kinds of knowledge and understanding of seeds, pesticides, and machinery, and now they're losing that as corporations gain power. And the pursuit of profit-oriented innovations drive technological lock-ins, making it harder to shift to more sustainable farming systems. And of course, as I mentioned already, the continued reliance on herbicide-centric models threaten environment and health. And what was really fascinating to me as I was working on the book, because half of the book is really quite historical, was that the wider costs of industrial farming have long been recognized. And, sometimes we think of Rachel Carson as the beginning of the critique of industrial agriculture, but actually she was kind of on the tail end of, some really interesting works. I mean, Paul Sear's book, Deserts on the March, on, talking about desertification and the Dust Bowl, et cetera. That was obviously published in the 30s. Anna Rochester's Why Farmers Are Poor, she published that in the 40s. Eve Balfour's book and Edward Faulkner's book, published in the 40s as well, about how plows and other, fertilizer use damages the soil. Same with Sir Albert Howard's War in the Soil. These was also published in the 40s. So a lot of early critique, and there was also a lot of academic papers critiquing and showing concern about the rise of pesticides, the rise of hybrid seeds, the rise of farm machinery and its consequences. And so these books have pointed out that farm machinery, for example, was very implicated in the displacement of indigenous peoples and also Black farmers in the US from land. Also implicated in soil damage and fertility loss, biodiversity loss, toxic pollution and pest resistance. I mean, these are all issues we're still talking about today, but they were raised nearly a century ago. The one that I would say is kind of a new understanding that we have and is climate change, because those early writers weren't as aware of what was going on, but climate change kind of adds complexity, I would say, to all of these problems that we're facing in the system. But I wanted to sort of show these books to be a reminder that we're not the first to make these critiques. And I think it's important for us to learn from these earlier critiques about how to address these kind of problems in the system and power in the system, because many of these books did point to power as being a problem. So what are the policy lessons? So in the final chapter of the book, I really try to pull out the policy lessons, and I have to be completely honest with you. I was a bit exhausted when I was writing the book, and I got to the final chapter is chapter 13, and I thought, oh my goodness, I can't have 13 chapters in the book. That's so unlucky. But that was it. I was only going to write one more chapter, so it's 13 chapters. But I focus on the policy implications here, and I pull out three of the big ones here, but I talk about the need for stronger competition policies. That's a really obvious policy lesson because we've seen this relaxation of antitrust and competition policies. They need to be made stronger to create more opportunities for alternative actors in the marketplace and to result in more competitive markets that would lead to more equitable outcomes. Of course, there's a lot of, ins and outs on that, but a second big recommendation I make is that we need more public support for alternative agricultural models such as agroecology. And I say this because it really was quite evident that the public sector played a huge role in delivering us the industrial agricultural model through its support for the fertilizer industry, its support for the pesticide industry, its support for the seed industry. And it can play an important role again for the next transition. I mean, we've had this big transition to industrial agriculture. We now need to transition away from it. And the state needs to play a role, I would argue. Of course, I was writing this before the election in the US. The manuscript was finalized last August. So the chance of that happening right now seems a little slim. And I also say we need better policies to counter corporate capture of food systems governance. And again, as I said, the book was finished before this big political change in the world. And we're seeing governance all over the place being captured by corporate interests. But it remains an extremely important objective if we want to address power in this sector. So the big takeaways, I'm coming up to the end here, but what I hope people take away from the book is that corporate power in the agri-food sector has very deep roots. It's not brand new. And looking at it this way in this long historical trajectory reveals important insights about patterns of control and sustainability in food systems. I think another big takeaway I want people to come away with is understanding that examining the interaction of markets, technology, and policy factors gives us a more nuanced understanding of the sources and exercise of power within food systems. And just finally, the big takeaway is that if we want to have a food systems transformation that brings us to more equitable and sustainable food systems, we have to address corporate power. And one of the big drivers for me in working on this topic at the time was that preparation and the holding of the UN Food Systems Summit, which many of you will know didn't pay a lot of attention to corporate power, and this led civil society to basically boycott that process. And I really wanted to show in detail, obviously too much detail, but why it matters. And so with that, I'm going to finish and say thank you, and I look forward to questions, and I'm really sorry if I talk for too long, Sharon.
No, Jennifer, my God, I think we could listen to you for hours. And as you were talking, I just thought, we're going to invite you back. I think we're going to have a series, if you're happy to do it, where we really just get to hear more from you, and then you really have that interaction with the audience, because it's so interesting and your insights are phenomenal. So a huge thank you. That I could listen to you for hours.
Thanks.
I'm going to hand over to Roxana now, and then there are lots of questions in the chat. We obviously aren't going to have time for all of them, but as I say, if Jennifer will come back, we'll hear more from her, and we'll have lots of time for the questions. But Roxana, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for such an articulate depiction of the current state of where the agri-food industries is sitting currently. I'll be also very short on my reflections to give room and space for the amazing questions we already have in the chat, but just wanted to bring about and summarize some of the key points from your presentation and how impactful the agri-food industries are on us, not just in terms of health, diet, and longevity, but in terms of political economy, the development of illness, environmental degradation, and also inequities. And this is so obvious now in how we're understanding and reframing the roles of foods, not just something inert on our plate, but something deeply influential and powerful. And because of that, foods have created the very companies, the titans that you mentioned throughout your research, that are commodifying, monopolizing, speculating on foods. And the consequences of those actions, we see them very deliberately in terms of the ecological crisis, the use of the fertilizers, pollution, and so forth, but also very much in health and inequities, because most of the outputs from the ag food sector, these are highly processed, industrialized commodities, ultra processed foods that are also associated with a plethora of non-communicable diseases. And in turns, because they're so palatable and accessible and affordable, they compete with healthier foods, which become too expensive for people to have access to. So paradoxically, as your research and your presentation shows, even though we're producing smarter foods, we're not necessarily producing better foods. So this is why I believe it's so important that you're bringing forth the agri-food industry as a lens to understand, to appreciate, and through your work and what we're hoping to achieve today and in the foreseeable future, to improve very much the biological, political, and economic discourse. And this is, as much as it is a global issue, is very present in Australia. And just to prove that I did a bit of the work, the homework in advance of the presentation, I wanted to bring a few data points from the titans that we have here in Australia, just to give more credence to your work and how they're similar. So this is data from the ACCC, the Australian regulator, and the parliamentary. We had an inquiry recently on the fertilizer producers. So we have 4 fertilizer firms that have a dominance of the 62% of the market share. In terms of seeds and herbicide firms, there are a plethora of actors, but most of them are international, like Syngenta and Bayern, the ones that you already mentioned. And last but not least, farm and machinery. We have 6 brands here that are concentrated from the manufacturing until the dealership. So very much of what you showed us in your last slides, we see that farmers are constrained between the producers and the dealers. So the warranties restrict them to purchase from the authorized dealerships, and the technology then restricts them in where they can do their repairs. So I'll use that as a starting point and as a basis for my first and only question to you. If you can draw some comparisons from the experience in the Northern Hemisphere in Northern America with the Australian context, and what kind of corporate strategies and lessons can be drawn from these alarming numbers.
Thanks, Roxana. Great comments and question. Yeah, it sounds from the specifics on at the domestic level in Australia that these patterns are quite similar in terms of the dominance of the top firms in terms of the marketplace, and also the ways in which they are shaping the market and shaping the technological landscape as well. I mean, I'd be curious to hear the extent to which this kind of lobbying is going on, the political power as well in the Australian context, but I suspect it's quite similar. In terms of your question, I mean, what can we learn? I mean, I think the Australian data points would confirm some of the big arguments that I'm trying to make. And that's one thing that when I was writing the book, I really wanted to spend a whole additional year looking at these sort of domestic cases around the world, because I know that context is really important, but as I said, I kind of ran out of time. I had to get back into the classroom. So I wrapped things up by focusing more on the global level, but I do think there are those kind of parallels. And in fact, what's really interesting to me about the Australian case is that the picture that I showed at the beginning of the Waterloo, it was the Sunshine Harvester. That was actually a joint venture with an Australian firm. And the there's actually been quite a long rivalry between Canada and Australia in terms of, you know, who was the first to invent the reaper and which machinery was better, because they were both in the sort of Commonwealth economy and vying for the same market. So there's just a little interesting factoid there about these connections. But for sure, I really appreciate your insights on the Australian case and look forward to learning more.